Here we are. We are ready for lecture 5, which covers John chapter 4. As always, we want to start with a little bit of an outline. You will see the screen has changed behind me. This is one of the digs where they have done some work. It is supposedly in Samaria on the east side of the mountains, so closer perhaps to Sukkar and Jacob's Well than other things. But Jacob's Well is now a inside of a church, has been for many centuries. So there aren't many photos that I could place myself on a mountain outside of town to do this lecture. But this helps see what the terrain would have looked like as they're walking around. Different things built up, lots of blocks for buildings, the like. So going to the outline of John chapter 4, we find the first 6 verses are a transition from where Jesus has been in the south to where he wants to go, Galilee, which is to the north. Verses 7 through 15 discuss the encounter he has with the woman from Samaria, the Samaritan woman. She has no name in the biblical account. 16 through 26 have to deal with what we call revelation, where he is speaking to her and she's beginning to understand who he is. We then have a transition in verses 27 through 30 as the disciples now arrive. And then in 31 through 38, we have what I call the lesson as he talks to his disciples about what has just taken place. 39 through 42 is confirmation, because now the Samaritans come out to him, the people of the city, which would be Sukkarians, if that was the city, but they're of Samaria, so that's all they're referred to as. Then we have another transition in verses 40 through 43 through 46 as he proceeds from Samaria up to Cana. And then we have the closing miracle in verses 46b, the second half, through 54. And we have the second sign as the royal official comes to him asking for help for his son. What we find, and this would be very useful to be looking at the notes that are available on the Moodle shell, but we have a chiastic structure happening. If we begin in chapter 2, where John provides his turning of water into wine. So in 1 through 12, we have a discussion of a miracle. That's the first sign. And so that would be, this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 6-part, 12, 13 part of a chiastic structure. So that'd be A. The closing part would be then verses 46b through 54, which is the second sign. After the miracle, we have a transition at 13 through 14. And so before the second miracle, we have a transition. We have a discussion of the temple in chapter 2, verses 15 through 22. And there's a discussion of the temple with the woman in chapter 4, verse 16 through 26. That would be part C. We have a discussion with Nicodemus in 2:23 through 3:13. And we have a discussion with a woman in 4:7 through 15. 3:14 through 21 is the narrator talking as I identify it. And here in 3:31 through 36, we also have identified the narrator speaking. Then we have a transition, part A, B, C, D, E, F, in 22 through 24 of chapter 3, and a transition in 4:1 through 6, making chapter 3, verse 25 through 30 about John the Baptizer, the center of that chiastic structure, drawing tremendous importance to what he says. So if we were to look at chapters 2, 3, and 4 chiastically, we'd say the most important thing that happens is the encounter with John the Baptist in 3:25 through 30. If we go back to that real briefly, we can see what is said. In 25 through 30, there's a discussion about purification. They come to John, Rabbi, the guy you talked about was baptizing. And John answered, "You yourselves are my witnesses. I'm not the Christ. I've been sent ahead of him. He who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom hears him, rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. He must increase, I must decrease," which is part of the repetition that we have. We goes all the way back to John chapter 1 verse 19, where we have John's denial of being the Messiah. So the crucial aspect is that actually he's reinforcing again that Jesus is the Messiah, and the discussion with the Samaritan woman actually informs that and concludes that. So we have an outline. This outline helps us then begin to understand that there might be larger structures in the gospel. And so we have the assignment coming up shortly of outlining chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. Certainly you can utilize the stuff that I provided, but what happens is you have to make a decision if we should end at chapter 3 or continue on through chapter 4. So the problem is there's some interlocking structures and you get to make a decision. There's nothing right or wrong you have to worry about, but what is leading you to make the decision is the question. What are the things that are causing you to think that chapter 1 verse 19 through chapter 3 36 is a section and should close, or what is making you think 119 through 454 is a section and should conclude there? And those are just the questions we have to deal with. And so this is sort of an experiment, both in outlining, which oftentimes get to do a lot of, because our perspective, our themes, our focus help shape the outline, and also in just defending a position. And that's what we want to do. So if we continue on and start talking about a few of the themes before we pause and record a second part of the video so this doesn't get too long, we see that one of the major themes is baptism and purification. Why? Because of the idea that we have talking about both the Pharisees. It starts out making that Jesus is now baptizing, right? He needs to leave. So what is this role of baptism? Well, it means a commitment to a new perspective. For John, he is proclaiming a baptism and people are coming out and repenting. But this isn't like the synoptics where there's a baptism for sins or the like. This is simply that people are becoming allied with John or with Jesus. And so the Pharisees who go out to question John are very likely getting ready to go out and question Jesus and ask him the questions, are you the Messiah? And he needs to leave because he's not quite ready for that information to become public. So the first of our themes is that and purification, right? The cleansing that takes place. Second major theme that we get to talk about is the 6th hour. What is the 6th hour? So timing is pretty important in the language that we're dealing with, but Jesus is walking and he is tired. We're in verse 6, and it is about the 6th hour. Now, we know that the timekeeping, they divided the day and the night into 12-hour sections. They didn't have minutes and seconds. So whatever the daytime was, they divided that into 12 segments. And so the 6th hour was the noon hour. Now, what makes it significant is the only other times this 6th hour is used, in John for sure, is to talk about Jesus' crucifixion. And so there is a linking, if we see again, between this story and the crucifixion. We saw a link between the mother of Jesus and him being on the cross at the end of the day. And here we have a link now with this Samaritan woman and the placing of Jesus on the 6th on the cross at noon. So we have that particular area. So John wants to provide us some specific information. It is an important time. The other thing that connects this is the fact that in this particular story, it mentions that he is thirsty, right? He is thirsty. He asks the woman for a drink. The other place where it talks about Jesus being thirsty is when he's on the cross. But here, they don't offer him water from a nice well. They offer him some sour wine that has now become a vinegar. It is so old. It's supposed to be an antiseptic and perhaps pain reliever that they provide. But we have connections between what's going on here in chapter 4 and what happens later in chapter 19. The final thing we want to talk about as a theme before we take a little pause is that the discussion turns in chapter 4 to the woman's husband. Now, we've actually been set up. If you go back to the words of John the Baptizer, right? He says, he who has the bride is the bridegroom, but I'm not the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. So this joy of mine has been made full. So just like at the end of chapter 2, we're set up for chapter 3 as they talk about Jesus performed other signs, but he didn't entrust himself to a man. And John 3 opens, a man came to him, Nicodemus, who then says, you must be from God because of the signs. Well, here we're set up to think about marriage. If we know the Old Testament stories, then we know that if a man is at a well and a single woman comes, it acts as a betrothal scene. We see this when Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac. We see this when Jacob goes to find a wife. He finds Rachel, but ends up with Leah and Rachel. And we see this with Moses. When he flees, he goes to a well, and many times the man is to protect this woman in some fashion or other. We see that especially in the Moses passage. And so when Jesus says to the woman he is meeting, who also is familiar with the Old Testament, because the Samaritans were following the Pentateuch, the 5 laws of Moses. These were very important as they had been set out by the Persians under Ezra and continue to be part of their religion. And we talk about the Samaritan Pentateuch even today. When he says, go call your husband, she says, I don't have one. I'm available. And then he says, you're right, you don't. You've had 5. So she's not quite as available as she thought she was. But it's set up to think that this is a betrothal scene, but it's not an actual betrothal scene. What it is a scene of revelation. And so with that, we want to go ahead and take a pause so this particular recording does not become too lengthy.